Welcome, beautiful soul. The angels wrap their wings around you right now, in this very moment. You are seen. You are loved. You are protected. This message did not find you by accident. You were guided here, and if you stay until the very end, something inside you is going to shift. Something is going to wake up. Because what the angels are about to reveal to you today is the one thing you have been waiting to hear. There is something unfolding in the spiritual world right now that has your name written all over it. Something powerful, something real, something that the universe has been moving quietly into place for longer than you may realize. Stay with us. Every single word in this message has been placed here just for you. Take a breath right now. Seriously. Pause for just a second and breathe in deeply. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the tension in your chest soften just a little. Because what is coming through from the angels today is something you need to receive with an open heart, not a guarded one. And the angels know that sometimes, when we have been waiting for something for a long time, we start to protect ourselves. We close off just a little. We stop hoping so loudly because the hoping and the waiting can feel like too much. If that is where you are right now, that is okay. You are safe here. And what you are about to hear is going to make every moment of that waiting feel worth it. The universe has been trying to reach you. It has been sending you signs in your quiet moments, in those sudden and unexplained feelings in your chest, in the dreams that stayed with you long after you opened your eyes, in the strange moments where someone crossed your mind out of nowhere and the feeling was so strong it actually surprised you. Those were not random. Those were not your imagination running wild. Those were messages. Those were the spiritual world pressing through the thin place between the invisible and the visible, trying to get your attention. And now, through this message, heaven is no longer whispering. It is speaking clearly, directly, with love and with urgency, because there is something you need to know before it arrives. There is a love that exists right now, a deep, soul-level, spiritually rooted love that is pointing directly at you. The person who carries this love in their heart has been thinking about you, not just sometimes, not just when it is convenient, every single day, in the middle of completely ordinary moments, in the silence before sleep, in the very first conscious thought of a new morning. You are there. Your presence lives in this person's mind and heart like something that cannot be removed because it was never just passing through. You were planted there by something greater, by a divine intelligence that knew exactly what it was doing. And the feeling this person carries is not a small, fragile thing. It is not a crush or a passing interest or something that will disappear when life gets busy. This is a love that has been tested by time. A love that has stayed quiet when it had to be, that has been patient when everything inside was pulling toward you, that has survived doubt and distance and all the ordinary chaos of life. And it is still there, still strong, still pointing at you. And now, right now, that patience is turning into something else. It is turning into a decision, a real, grounded, soul-level decision. And the angels want you to know what that decision looks like before it reaches your door, so that you are ready to receive it with your whole heart open. The one who loves you is done waiting. They are done holding back, done running through the calculations in their head, wondering if the timing will ever be perfect. Here is something the angels want to speak directly to your heart about timing. The universe does not wait for perfect. It waits for ready. And something has shifted in this person at a very deep level. A kind of holy certainty has settled into them. A knowing. The kind that comes not from the mind but from somewhere much deeper. And that knowing is moving them toward you with a clarity and a purpose that no distraction can touch. They have tried other paths. Let the angels be honest with you about that, because honesty is part of what makes this message real. This person has looked for peace in other places. They have been in situations and connections that seemed like they might fill the space. And none of it worked. Not because those things were bad, but because nothing else was built to give them what they were actually looking for. Because what they are looking for lives in you. You are not just a person to this soul. You are the answer to a question their spirit has been asking for a very long time. And the more they searched everywhere else, the clearer that answer became. You are someone's answer. Let that be real to you right now. Not as a sweet idea that you hear and then set aside. As a living truth that you hold in your body. You are someone's peace. You are the reason a door closed behind someone in their heart. Not because they were forced to walk through it, but because once they truly felt what they feel for you, everything behind that door stopped making sense. You cannot go back to false when you have touched something true. You can only move forward. And that is what is happening. The angels are showing something very sacred about what this person has been doing quietly in their own life. They have been releasing, letting go of old stories, old fears, old connections that had run their course. They have been doing the inner work, facing the parts of themselves that needed to grow, choosing over and over again to rise above patterns that were not serving the love they wanted to live. This is not easy work, but they have been doing it, not because someone required it of them, because the love they feel for you made everything shallow feel impossible to settle for. When you carry a real love inside you, it raises your standard for everything. It makes you want to become someone worthy of it. That is what this person has been quietly becoming. And now there is nothing in the way. The angels want to speak about the energy you may have been feeling lately. Have there been moments where something felt different, even if you could not name it? A warmth in your chest that arrived unexpectedly. A thought of someone that came so suddenly and so strongly it almost took your breath. A night where a dream felt too vivid, too real, too loaded with meaning to just be noise. A moment where you simply knew, underneath all the uncertainty, that something was shifting. If any of that sounds familiar, and the angels say it will, for the one receiving this message, that was not your mind playing tricks. That was the spiritual world touching you. That was the love that is approaching you, sending ripples forward in time, so that when it finally arrives, something in you will recognize it. Pay attention to those feelings. They are not random. They are communication from the universe, and they are getting louder because the arrival is getting closer. Beautiful soul, the angels want to address something that lives quietly in many hearts but often goes unspoken. The question underneath the longing. The wondering that you may not say out loud but feel in the tender places. Is there truly someone out there who will really see me? Not just the easy parts of me, not just the version I show the world when everything is fine, but all of me, the complicated parts, the uncertain parts, the parts one am still figuring out. Will someone stay for those? Will someone choose me, not despite all of that, but with full knowledge of it? The answer coming through from the angels right now is yes. An unqualified, full-hearted, heaven-backed yes. The person carrying this love for you does not want a polished, performed version of you. They want the real one. They are drawn to your depth. They are not afraid of your complexity. Everything about you that you have ever wondered if anyone would accept. Your quietness, your intensity, your tenderness, your history, your particular way of moving through the world. This person finds those things beautiful. Finds those things exactly what they were looking for. Because this is not a love that needs you to be different. It is a love that was built for who you already are. This soul sees you with the eyes of someone who has looked at a lot of things in this world and recognized that most of it is surface. And then they looked at you and they saw something real underneath. something worth choosing, something worth staying for. Let the angels speak now about the values that live in the heart of this approaching love. Because this is important, knowing not just that love is coming but understanding the kind of love it is. What this person wants to build with you is something grounded in truth. Not perfect, not without difficulty, but honest, real. The kind of love where you can actually say what you are thinking without performing. Where you can have a hard day and not have to pretend everything is fine. Where you can be vulnerable without it being used against you. Where the hard conversations happen with respect and the soft moments happen without awkwardness. Because there is real safety between you. What this soul wants with you is a love built on peace. Not the absence of challenge. Real life always has challenge. But the presence of steadiness. A place inside the connection where both of you can land when the world outside gets loud. A love that is a shelter rather than another source of pressure. A love where being together genuinely feels lighter than being apart. They want open communication between you. Not just talking about the easy things, but the ability to say the real things. The fears, the hopes, the things that are hard to put into words, and have them received with care. They want to know your inner world. Not just the facts of your life, but the texture of it. What makes you laugh until you cannot breathe. What keeps you up at night. What you dream about when you let yourself dream big. They want to know all of it. And they want to share theirs with you in return. This person values presence. Not just being in the same room, but truly being there. Looking at you with attention, listening without distraction, being with you fully in ordinary moments. Because they understand that love is not just built in the big, dramatic scenes. It is built in the small moments. The ones that are easy to overlook but are actually the whole thing. A shared look across a room. A comfortable silence. Showing up without being asked because they just knew you needed it. And this person values freedom inside. Love. Not the freedom to be careless with each other, but the freedom to be fully themselves, and to let you be fully yourself within the connection. The kind of love where both people grow as individuals while also growing together. Where there is space to breathe and to dream and to be a whole person. That kind of love does not shrink you. It expands you. It holds you and sets you free at the same time. And that combination is rare, and it is sacred, and it is exactly what is on its way to you. What is also present in this heart is a commitment to staying. Not just when it is easy, not just when everything is beautiful and new and exciting, but through the ordinary days, the tired days, the days when nothing goes right and patience wears thin. This person has thought about what love really means over the long run, and they have made a decision, not an emotional impulse, but a grounded, clear-eyed, soul-level decision, that they want to be the kind of person who stays, who chooses every day, who shows up even when it is hard, because that is what real love is, not a feeling that comes and goes, a choice that is made again and again, and that is what they are bringing to you. The angels want to speak about something that is deeply spiritual in what is unfolding between you and this person. What is happening here is not ordinary. The pull that exists, the connection this soul feels so strongly, the way they cannot stop thinking about you or stop feeling the rightness of what they feel, that is not just chemistry or coincidence. That is a soul agreement. Something that was put in place before either of you fully understood it. A spiritual thread that connects you, that grows stronger rather than weaker when tested, that has survived everything that should have broken it. The universe is intentional. It does not do anything by accident. And when it brings two souls into each other's awareness the way these two souls have been brought together, it is because there is a purpose. A shared journey, something each of you needs to grow into that the other carries the key for. This is not about dependence. It is about alignment. It is about two people whose paths, when combined, create something greater and more beautiful than either path alone. You have always known this on some level, have you not? That whoever was meant for you would feel like a recognition rather than a discovery. Less like meeting someone new and more like remembering someone you had almost forgotten. Less like building something from scratch and more like continuing something that was already begun. That is what is coming. That familiar, arriving, finally kind of love. The angels are also showing that the universe has been doing work behind the scenes of your life. Clearing, preparing, making space. There may have been things that left your life recently, situations, connections, circumstances, that at the time felt like loss but were actually just removal. The universe making room. You cannot build something new in a space that is already crowded with what is old and no longer serving you. The clearing that has happened, in whatever form it took in your life, was not punishment. It was preparation. It was the universe saying, something better is coming, and we need room for it. Trust what has been removed. Trust the spaces that have opened up. Those spaces are not empty. They are ready. They are waiting. They are the room that love is about to walk into. And now the angels want to speak directly to anything in you that has ever doubted whether you deserve this. Because there can be a story, buried sometimes very deep, that says love like this is for other people. That people like me do not get this. That something about who I am or what I have been through or what I have done makes me less worthy of something real and beautiful and lasting. If that story has ever visited you, and the angels say it has, for many who are receiving this today, please hear this clearly. That story is not true. It was never true. It was a wound talking, not a fact. It was old pain creating old conclusions that never belonged to you. Your worthiness of love is not something you earn. It is not something you lose when you make mistakes. It is not conditional on how put together you are or how much you have figured out or how perfectly you have handled everything in your past. You are worthy of love because you exist, because you are here, because the same force that placed the stars in the sky also placed breath in your lungs, and that force does not make things that are not worthy of love. You are worthy of the most beautiful, honest, steady, soul-nourishing love that exists. Not someday, now, as you are right now with everything you are still becoming. And the love that is coming to you knows that. This person does not see your past as a reason to hesitate. They see you, the full, real, living version of you, and they choose you, freely, with full awareness. Not because you are perfect, but because you are true. And truth is more valuable to a real love than perfection will ever be. Beautiful soul, the angels want to paint a picture for you of what this love will feel like when it arrives. Because sometimes, when we have been waiting a long time, we lose our sense of what we are waiting for. We forget what it feels like to be genuinely chosen. What it feels like when someone really sees us and stays anyway. When this love arrives, it will feel like relief. Deep, settling, bone-level relief. Like a breath you have been holding for a very long time finally being let go. There will be a moment, maybe in a glance, maybe in a conversation, maybe in the simple and unexplainable way that energy moves between two people, where something inside you will settle in a way it has not settled before. And some part of you, the quiet and knowing part that has always carried the truth, will recognize. This is the one. This is what I was waiting for. This is why the other things did not work out. There will be ease between you. Not the ease of things that do not matter, but the ease of things that fit. Conversations that flow because there is real curiosity on both sides. Silence that is comfortable because both of you are relaxed enough to simply be. Laughter that surprises you with how good it feels to laugh that freely with someone. And underneath all of it, that settled, peaceful certainty that you do not have to perform here. You do not have to manage how you are coming across. You can simply be yourself, and that is not only enough, it is exactly what is wanted. This person is going to look at you in a way you will feel in your whole body. Not just a surface glance, but a real looking. The kind where someone is actually seeing you, not just the image of you. And in that looking there will be something you recognize from the deepest part of yourself, acceptance. Full, unconditional, I see all of you and I am still here acceptance. That is what is coming. That is the energy currently moving toward you through the spiritual realm. The angels also want to acknowledge the journey you have been on that brought you here. Not because it is over, life is always a journey, but because the angels see it. They see every moment where you wondered if love was really out there for you. Every time you felt the longing and had nothing to put it toward. Every time you thought maybe you had missed it, or maybe it had passed you by, or maybe you were hoping for too much. The angels want you to know, none of that was wasted. Every bit of that journey was building something in you, was deepening your capacity to receive what is coming, was teaching you things about yourself, about love, about what you actually want, that you needed to know before this love arrived. You needed to know your own worth. You needed to understand what real love feels like versus what a shadow of love feels like. You needed to develop the patience and the faith that will allow you to receive something beautiful without running from it out of fear. All of that was preparation, and it has been working, because you are here and you are listening, and something in you is open right now in a way it perhaps has not always been. That openness is everything. That is the invitation the universe has been waiting for. Not for you to be perfect or completely healed or fully figured out. Just open, just willing, just available to something real. And you are. The angels can feel it. Right now, as you receive this message, there is an openness in you that is like a door that has been quietly unlocked. You may not have even noticed it happening, but it happened, and through that unlocked door, love is going to walk. Beautiful soul, let the angels speak now about the specific qualities of what is being built between you and this person in the spiritual realm. Because the angels want you to understand that this is not vague or undefined. This is specific. This is intentional. The universe does not build in generalities, it builds in details. And the details of what is being prepared for you are beautiful. The life this person envisions with you is not grand or complicated. It is simple in the best way. Morning conversations over something warm. Long talks about everything and nothing. The kind of walks where you lose track of time because the conversation is too good. Sitting in comfortable quiet and feeling full instead of empty. Sharing the ordinary stuff, the small frustrations of the day, the weird thoughts, the things that made you laugh, with someone who is genuinely interested. Building a world together, slowly, one ordinary day at a time, that becomes the most extraordinary thing either of you has ever known. This person wants to be there for the hard days too, not just the easy ones. They are not looking for a highlight reel of a life with you. They want the real version. They want to know your struggles and sit with you in them. They want to be the person you call when something is wrong, not just the person you celebrate with when things are right. Because that is what commitment actually means. It means showing up in the whole of it. And this soul is ready to show up in the whole of it with you. The angels are showing something else that is powerful in the heart of this approaching love. Gratitude. This person carries a deep and genuine gratitude for you, not just for what you might do for them, but for who you are, for the specific way you move through the world, for the particular light that comes off you, for the qualities that are uniquely yours. They do not take you for granted. They have already spent enough time thinking about you, longing for you, understanding what it would mean to have you in their life. That they already understand your value in a way that will never allow for carelessness. You will feel noticed by this love. You will feel appreciated. The small things you do will be seen. The effort you put into caring will be received. The parts of yourself you quietly offer will be recognized and valued. And that recognition, being truly seen by someone who loves you, is one of the most healing things a human heart can experience. The angels also want to speak about the spiritual dimension of what it means when two people come together who were meant to be together. There is an alchemy that happens. Both people begin to grow in ways they could not have grown apart. The connection itself becomes a kind of teacher. What lives in one person brings out something in the other. The love itself creates conditions for healing. Old wounds becoming less sharp, old fears losing their grip, old ways of being that no longer serve beginning to naturally fall away. Not because either person forces the other to change, but because love, when it is real, creates safety. And in safety, people can finally release what they have been holding. This is what this connection will do for you. It will create a safety in your life that allows you to exhale, that allows you to put down things you have been carrying without even fully realizing you were carrying them, that allows you to become a freer, lighter, more fully alive version of yourself. Not because this person fixes you, you do not need fixing, but because in the presence of a love that truly sees you and truly stays, the heart opens in ways it could not open before. And you will do the same for them. This is a two-way alchemy. What you carry will be exactly what this person needs to grow into who they are becoming. Your presence in their life will unlock things in them, will bring out their best self, will create the conditions for them to become more fully the person they are meant to be. That is what it means when two souls are aligned at the level these two souls are aligned. This is not a small love. This is not an ordinary connection. This is something the universe has been building with intention and care. And it is almost ready to manifest in the physical world. Beautiful soul, as this message begins to move toward its close, the angels want to address the most common question that rises in the heart when receiving a message like this. And the question is, when? When is this actually going to happen? When do I get to stop waiting and start living this? The answer the angels bring is both simple and profound. It is already happening. Not somewhere in the far future. Right now. In this moment. In the invisible realm, things are being arranged. In this person's heart, the decision has already been made. In the universe's design, the path between you is already being cleared. What is invisible today is becoming visible. What is spiritual today is becoming physical. The approach is already underway. And the angels ask you to do just one thing with that knowing. They ask you to relax into it. Not to stop caring, not to become passive, but to release the strain of trying to force or rush or control the timing. The universe is already handling it with far more precision and grace than any effort of control could achieve. Your job right now is simply to stay open, to keep your heart available, to believe, not just want to believe, but truly believe that love is real and it is meant for you and it is coming. Let go of the need to know every detail. Let go of the need to figure out exactly how it will happen. Let the universe handle the how, because the universe is extraordinarily good at the how. You just stay in your yes. You just stay available to goodness. You just stay present in your own life, doing the things that bring you alive, being fully yourself, because that is exactly where love will find you. Not hiding, not performing, not trying to be what you think someone else needs. Just you being fully, freely, honestly you. That is the frequency that calls this love forward. That is the signal the universe uses to know they are ready. Bring it home. The angels surround you now with the most golden, warm, and peaceful light you have ever felt. They gather close around you, filling the air with something that feels like tenderness. They place their hands gently over your heart, and they speak these words directly into your spirit, not from a distance but from right here, right beside you in this moment. You are loved more deeply than your human heart has fully grasped yet. You are protected in every moment, even the ones that have felt uncertain and alone. You are not forgotten. You have never been forgotten, not for a single second. The love that was always meant for you has not disappeared or been given to someone else. It is on its way to you with the patience and the precision of everything the universe does when it is doing something sacred. Keep your heart open. Keep your spirit soft and trusting. Keep believing in the goodness that is meant for your life. Because goodness is not just meant for certain people. It is meant for you. It has always been meant for you. The universe made you for love, and love was made for you. The best is not behind you. The most beautiful chapters of your story are ahead. They are arriving now in this season, in this time, with a grace and certainty and a depth of care that will take your breath away. You are loved. You are chosen. You are held. You are cherished by forces greater than you can see. And the love that is coming will prove all of that in ways that will stay with you forever. Receive this blessing with every part of you. Let it go all the way down to the places that have been waiting the longest. Let it reach the parts of you that stopped hoping. Let it arrive in every corner of your heart. Because this message was not sent to you by accident, and neither is the love that is on its way. You are loved. You are so deeply, completely, and truly loved. There is one more thing the angels want to place in your heart before this message is complete. And it is perhaps the most important thing of all. The love that is coming to you is not something you have to hold on to with tight fists once it arrives. You do not have to be afraid of losing it. You do not have to monitor it or guard it with anxiety or brace yourself for it to disappear the way other things have disappeared. This love was not built on sand. It was built on something solid, on a foundation that the spiritual world itself laid down with care. And what the universe builds with intention does not crumble easily. You can actually relax inside this love when it comes. You can trust it. You can let yourself feel it fully without holding back part of yourself as a precaution. You can be all the way in it, all the way present for it, all the way open to it, and it will still be there. Because it chose you not in a moment of impulse but in a season of deep and considered certainty. Because the person bringing this love to you has already moved through their doubt and come out the other side of it with a clarity that will not bend. The angels want you to practice something right now, even before this love arrives. Practice receiving. Practice letting goodness land without immediately wondering when it will leave. Practice believing that beautiful things are allowed to stay in your life. Practice saying thank you to the universe, to the angels, to the divine intelligence that has been working on your behalf this entire time, for what is already in motion. Gratitude calls things forward. Gratitude opens the channel between the invisible and the visible. When you live in thankfulness for what is coming, you become magnetic to it. You align with it. You become the frequency it can find. So practice gratitude for this love even now, even before it fully arrives. Say to yourself, I am grateful for the love that is on its way to me. I am grateful for the person who has been carrying these feelings in their heart. I am grateful to the universe for arranging everything so carefully. I am grateful that I am worthy of this and that I know it. Let that gratitude become something you carry in your body like a warmth, like a light, like a quiet joy underneath everything else that is happening in your life right now. Because something magnificent is on its way to you, and it deserves to be welcomed. The angels also want to speak about the love you carry inside yourself, because this message is not only about what is coming from the outside. It is also about what is already living in you. There is a love in your own heart that is ready to give itself. A tenderness, a loyalty, a depth of caring that you have perhaps not had the right place to pour it. All of that has been building in you. All of that is part of what makes you so worthy of what is coming, because you are not just going to receive this love, you are going to give it back in kind. And the beauty of what will be built between you is not just what one person brings. It is what both people bring. What is created in the space between two hearts that are genuinely open to each other. Your capacity to love is not small. Even if life has put you through things that made it feel like it was becoming smaller, it was not. It was only being protected, saved up, kept safe for the right place to pour it. And that place is coming. And when you find it, all of that saved up love is going to have somewhere to go. And it is going to feel extraordinary, like finally being able to breathe out after a very long time. The angels close with this final vision. They see you, in the not-too-distant future, living something you once only allowed yourself to dream about in the quiet. They see you with a softness on your face that only comes from feeling genuinely loved. They see you laughing more easily, moving through your days with a lightness you have not always had. Waking up and feeling in that first moment of consciousness that life is good, that you are held, that the person beside you, in whatever way they are present in your life, sees you and chooses you and is there. They see you arriving home to yourself through love. And it is the most beautiful thing. That is what is coming. That is what the universe has been building for you. That is what the angels are confirming for you today with all the love in the heavenly realm. You are so loved, now and always. Go forward in peace, in trust, and in the quiet and steady faith that everything is being taken care of. Because it is, because you are, and because love, real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that heals, the kind that was made for you, is already on its way home. Amen.